A mob boss watches a poor cashier save his mother's life, only to see her fired moments later. On a bitter, snow-swept evening outside a grocery store in South Chicago, an elderly woman stood frozen in the middle of the parking lot. Her thin coat was dusted with white, her frail body trembling, her voice cracking as she cried out for a son she couldn't remember how to find. People watched from the warmth of the entrance. Cars slowed but never stopped. No one stepped forward. No one except Elise, a gaunt young cashier already one write-up away from losing her job, and with it, any chance of saving her little sister who was waiting for a surgery they couldn't afford. She pushed through the glass doors into the freezing wind, pulled off her only jacket, and draped it over the old woman's shaking shoulders, then knelt beside her and began to sing, a lullaby her mother used to hum before she abandoned Elise at an orphanage door. Her voice rose soft and steady through the falling snow, cutting through the panic, gently guiding the lost woman back to herself. Elise had no idea that in the black SUV parked in the shadows across the lot, the most dangerous man in Chicago was watching every single moment. That the woman she was saving was his mother, or that what he witnessed in those few fragile minutes would change the course of her life forever. If this story touched your heart, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another story. We'll see you in the next one. Elise guided the elderly woman through the glass doors, and the warmth from inside the store rushed out like welcoming arms. But she knew that welcome wouldn't last. Snow melted from her hair and dripped onto the tiled floor, gathering into small puddles. Her shirt was soaked through because she'd placed her only coat over the woman's shoulders, and now the cold was seeping into her bones. The old woman still clung to Elise's hand, fingers trembling yet refusing to let go, as if Elise were the only lifeline in a vast, open sea. "Don't leave me," she whispered, her voice rough with fear. "Please, don't leave me alone." Elise squeezed her hand gently, trying to pass along a little warmth she no longer had herself. "I won't," she said softly. "I'm right here." But the instant those words left her lips, the office door at the back of the store flew open with a bang. "Mr." Graves stormed out like a squall, his face flushed red with anger, his small eyes narrowed with resentment. He'd been the manager of this store for 12 years, and in all 12 of them he'd never missed a chance to make an employee feel small. "Whitmore," he roared, his voice echoing through the store and making customers turn their heads. "You abandoned your register. Do you have any idea how many customers were waiting? Do you have any idea what you've done?" Elise felt every gaze pin on her. She swallowed, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Sir," she was alone in the snow. She could have frozen to death. She could have. "I don't care if she was drowning." Graves cut in, stepping closer, the smell of old coffee and anger rising off him. "Your job is inside, not outside playing hero. You think you're special? You think the rules don't apply to you?" Around them, customers began to murmur. A few lifted their phones, recording as if this were a free reality show. Elise felt her cheeks burn with shame, but she stood straight and didn't bow her head. "Sir, please." She was scared. She was calling for her son. "I couldn't just..." "You couldn't just what? Do your job? Follow the rules? That's exactly what you couldn't do." Graves jabbed a finger toward her face, and at that moment the elderly woman suddenly tightened her grip on Elise's hand. She lifted her head, and for a rare moment her cloudy eyes brightened with startling clarity. "Don't yell at her," she said, her voice unsteady but firm with authority. "She saved me. She was the only one who came. The only one." Graves looked at her as if she were an annoying fly. He didn't even bother to answer, only flicked his hand and turned back to Elise with eyes as cold as ice. "You're done," he said, each word dropping like a hammer. "Take off the apron. Hand over your badge. I want you out of my store in 5 minutes." Elise stood there, her feet nailed to the floor. She heard the customers' whispers, the click of phones, the distant beep of a register somewhere far away. But it all seemed to sink into a thick fog. All she could think about was Rosie. Her sister lay in their cramped apartment, struggling to breathe through bluish lips, waiting for the surgery that now would never come. $180,000. That was what Elise still lacked. That was the distance between her sister's life and her sister's death. And now, no job meant no money. No money meant no surgery. No surgery meant she couldn't bear to think any further. With shaking hands, Elise untied the worn blue apron. She removed the employee badge from her chest, where the name Elise W. was printed in ink that had faded. She placed both into Graves's hand, not meeting his eyes, not saying a single word. Tears pressed close, but she bit down and held them back. She wouldn't cry in front of him. She wouldn't give him that satisfaction. The elderly woman was still holding her hand, and Elise gently eased free, trying to smile at her even as her lips were pressed tight to keep back a sob. "You'll be okay," she whispered to the woman. "Someone will come for you. Someone will." Just then, the store's automatic doors slid open. A blade of cold air swept in, carrying the last snowflakes of the evening, and then someone stepped inside. The air in the store seemed to freeze. Elise didn't know why, but she felt the shift, felt the way everyone around her fell suddenly silent, felt how even Graves went rigid. She slowly turned her head, and she saw the man who'd just crossed the threshold. The man walked in as if he owned not only this store, but the world beyond these walls. Tall, broad-shouldered, wrapped in a long black coat that fell nearly to his knees. His black hair was slicked back with neat precision, and his gray eyes swept the room like a cold blade, sharp and without hesitation. Each step rang on the tile floor, unhurried, assured, and strangely dangerous. No rushing, no need to prove anything, only the simple presence of a man accustomed to the world stopping when he appeared. Elise noticed the way the air in the store changed. The earlier murmurs fell silent, then rose again in a different tone, tighter, more fearful. Someone in the crowd whispered, voice trembling, "Is that Kincaid?" The name spread like an undertow from one person to the next, and Elise saw faces around her blanch, but Graves didn't seem to notice. He still had his back to the door, his eyes fixed on Elise with the smug satisfaction of a man who'd just won a petty little battle. "And don't think about using me as a reference," he kept on humiliating her, his voice thick with contempt. "No one wants to hire a troublemaker who can't follow simple rules. You'll be lucky to find work anywhere in this." He never got to finish the sentence. The man in the black coat walked past him as if he didn't exist, heading straight for the elderly woman who was still standing beside Elise, trembling. And then his voice rose, so gentle Elise almost didn't believe her own ears. "Mom," just that one word, and it carried a whole world of worry and relief. "Are you okay?" The woman lifted her head, and her cloudy eyes flared bright, as if someone had just lit a candle inside her. "Ashton," she cried, her voice overflowing with happiness. "My boy, you found me. I was so lost. And then, she turned, her trembling hand pointing toward Elise. "This girl, she sang for me. She brought me back. In the snow, when everything was so dark and scary, she sang for me and brought me back." Ashton followed the direction of his mother's hand, and for the first time his gaze stopped on Elise. She stood there, slight in her soaked employee uniform, lips tinged blue from the cold, hair in disarray with water still clinging from the melting snow. Yet she remained upright. She didn't bow her head. She didn't step back. Her eyes didn't flinch from his sharp, icy stare. A moment passed, only a second or two, but to Elise it stretched into a lifetime. He didn't speak. He only looked at her with something hard to read, as if he were trying to solve an equation without being able to find the formula. Then Ashton turned to Graves, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees. "You," he said, his voice no longer gentle, but cold as the winter ice outside. "You just fired the woman who saved my mother." Graves stood there, mouth hanging open, the red in his face drained fast, leaving him pale as paper. His eyes jumped from Ashton to the elderly woman, then to Elise, and finally back to Ashton with a growing, unmistakable horror. "Mr. Kincaid," he stammered, his voice stripped of every shred of swagger it had minutes ago. I didn't know she was. I mean, I couldn't have known that." "That what?" Ashton cut in, his tone terrifyingly calm. "That the woman in your parking lot was my mother? That the only person willing to help her was one of your employees? That you just humiliated and fired her in front of all these people for the crime of being a decent human being?" Graves opened his mouth, but no words came. He stood there like a fish on dry land, sweat beginning to bead on his forehead even though it was the dead of winter outside. Ashton stepped closer, and though he didn't raise his voice, every word he spoke echoed through the store's lethal silence. "This district belongs to my family. Every store, every block, every inch of concrete and brick. Did you forget?" Another man came in, tall and lean in a black suit, his face unreadable. He stopped beside Ashton, and with a small nod from his boss, he pulled out his phone and moved off to the side. Elise couldn't hear the conversation, but she saw Graves's eyes track the man's every movement with mounting fear. In less than 5 minutes, the phone in Graves's pocket began to vibrate. He glanced at the screen, and his face collapsed completely. Whatever he read there destroyed any remaining hope. Someone from corporate had just called, and Elise didn't need to be a genius to guess what it was about. She stood there, watching it all unfold like something out of a surreal dream. Part of her thought that maybe now everything would be okay. Maybe she'd get her job back. Maybe life would slide back into normal. But when Ashton Kincaid turned to look at her, she knew at once that nothing would ever go back to the way it was. His gray eyes settled on her, still as unreadable as before, but now there was something else in them. Curiosity, calculation, or something she didn't dare to name. "Come with me," he said. Not quite a command, but not an invitation either. "We need to talk." Outside the store, the snow kept falling without pause, white flakes spinning through the bitter wind like tiny dancers in winter's ballet. Elise stood on the sidewalk, arms wrapped around herself in a futile attempt to hold on to warmth. Her only coat was still draped over the old woman's shoulders inside, and now the biting cold cut straight through her thin, soaked uniform. She shivered in waves, her teeth chattering, but she didn't turn back to retrieve it. She didn't even know if she could step inside that store again. Ashton Kincaid came out behind her, and for a moment he simply stood there watching. Elise could feel his gaze on her back, heavy and unreadable. Then, without a word, he removed his long, expensive black coat and settled it over her shoulders. She startled and turned, ready to refuse, but the warmth seeped into her skin at once, and her body betrayed her reason, pulling the coat tighter around herself. It was heavy and warm, carrying the scent of sandalwood and something else she couldn't name, something refined and far removed from her world. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice still trembling from the cold. Ashton didn't reply. He stood facing her, hands in his pockets, seemingly untouched by the cold, though he wore only his suit jacket now. Snow gathered in his dark hair, along the shoulders of his gray suit, but he didn't brush it away. His gray eyes fixed on her, and Elise felt as though he were reading every page of her life, every chapter, missing nothing. "Why did you do it?" he asked bluntly, his tone stripped of any polite courtesy. "You knew you'd lose your job. You knew that man would fire you, so why?" Elise looked at him, unable to understand why the question seemed so difficult for him. To her, the answer was so simple it hardly needed saying. She needed help, she replied, her voice steadier than she expected. She was alone, scared, lost in the snow. I couldn't just stand there and watch. No one else was going to help her. Ashton fell silent, his head tilting slightly as if she had spoken in a language he'd never heard before. He regarded her the way one studies something unfamiliar, with curiosity and doubt, as though he couldn't quite believe she was real. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the wind and the soft hush of falling snow. Then he spoke again, his voice low and even. "My mother has Alzheimer's. She's been sick for 3 years now. Some days she remembers who I am. Some days she doesn't recognize her own face in the mirror." He paused, and for the first time, Elise saw a faint crack in the armor of his composure. "I've hired the best caretakers money can buy. Nurses, specialists, therapists. None of them lasted more than a month. Some quit. Some I had to let go because they couldn't handle her when she gets confused or afraid." He stepped closer, and Elise had to lift her chin to meet his eyes. "But none of them, not a single one in 3 years, could calm her the way you did in 5 minutes. Out there in the snow, when she was lost and terrified, you sang to her and brought her back." Elise didn't know what to say. She had only done what anyone with a heart would have done, yet to him it seemed like a miracle. "Work for me," he said, not as a question but as a statement. "Live in my house, take care of my mother. I'll pay you 10 times what you made at that store." Elise felt her heart begin to race. 10 times. With that money, she could cover Rosie's hospital bills. She could save her sister. But something in his voice, in the way people inside the store had looked at him with unmistakable fear, made her take a step back. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice wary. "Really? Who are you?" He didn't appear offended. If anything, the faintest shadow of a smile brushed his lips, cold and without warmth. "Ashton Kincaid," he answered simply, as though the name alone explained everything. And it did. Elise felt the blood in her veins turn to ice. Kincaid. Who in Chicago didn't know that name? It appeared in articles about unsolved cases, in whispers about people who vanished without a trace, in rumors of an underground empire controlling half the city. He wasn't a businessman. He was something far more dangerous. I can't, she said, shaking her head even as every cell in her body screamed about the money, about Rosie, about the surgery. I can't work for someone like you. I've heard the stories. I know what you are. Ashton showed no anger, no disappointment. He only looked at her with something close to respect, touched with a hint of amusement. Fair enough, he said. Then he drew a black card with silver lettering from the inside pocket of his suit. He held it out to her, but she didn't take it. Her arms still crossed, clutching his coat around her. He didn't insist. Instead, he stepped forward, and before she could react, he slipped the card gently into the pocket of the coat she was wearing. When you change your mind, he said, his voice certain, as though he were stating an inevitable truth. And you will. Call that number. Any time, day or night. Then he turned and walked away toward the black SUV waiting across the parking lot. The man in the suit, whom Elise guessed was named Sterling, had already helped Maggie into the vehicle and stood holding the door for his employer. Elise remained there, watching until the vehicle disappeared into the white curtain of snow. Her hand rose unconsciously to touch the pocket where the card now rested. It was weightless, only a small piece of paper, and yet why did it feel so heavy? Like a promise. Or a curse. She didn't yet know which. The apartment sat on the 5th floor of a worn-out building on the south side, where the elevator had been broken for 3 years and never repaired. Elise climbed each creaking step, Ashton Kincaid's black coat still draped over her shoulders, too large and too elegant for the bleak surroundings. She stopped in front of door number 512, its paint peeling and the lock rusted, then eased it open carefully so it wouldn't make a sound. Inside, the apartment was a single, cramped room, barely enough space for a narrow bed, a folding table, and a pitiful kitchenette in the corner. The heater had been broken since the start of winter, and no matter how many times Elise had called the landlord, he'd offered promises, and never once appeared. Cracks ran along the walls like veins on an elderly hand, and in the corner she could see a cockroach moving slowly across the floor. But none of that mattered. The only thing that mattered lay on the narrow bed pushed against the window. Rosie slept curled beneath a thick blanket, her small face pale as paper, her lips faintly tinged blue. Even in sleep, her breathing was labored, her chest rising and falling unevenly as though every breath were a battle. 8 years old. She was only 8, yet she'd been fighting her own body for her entire short life. Elise sat beside the bed and gently pulled the blanket back up over Rosie's shoulder. Her hand brushed soft strands of hair from the little girl's forehead, and her heart tightened at the sight of that fragile face. Rosie wasn't her biological sister. They didn't share blood, parents, or history. But to Elise, none of that mattered. She had chosen Rosie. She'd claimed her as a sister when the child was only 2, lying in a crib at the orphanage, overlooked because no one wanted to adopt a sick child. Elise had promised herself she'd protect her, give her a family, never let her feel the loneliness Elise herself had known. The memory of the doctor's words from the previous week rose sharp and merciless in her mind. He'd looked at her with a pity she despised, then spoken in the gentle tone reserved for bad news. Without surgery, she has 6 months. Maybe less. Her heart simply can't take much more. I'm sorry. Elise stood and moved to the folding table where a stack of bills and documents lay piled. She picked up the top sheet even though she knew every figure by heart. $200,000 for the heart surgery. She'd put down $20,000. Every cent she'd saved over 9 relentless years of work. $180,000 remained. $180,000. She could work until the end of her life and never earn that much, especially now that she'd lost her job. Just then her phone vibrated. The hospital's number glowed on the screen, and her heart sank before she even answered. Miss Whitmore? The woman's voice on the other end was polite but distant, the professional tone used to deliver news no one wants to hear. I'm calling from the billing department at St. Mary's. I need to remind you that the deadline for the remaining deposit is in 10 days. If we don't receive the payment by then, we'll have to give Rosie's surgical slot to another patient. Elise closed her eyes, gripping the phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. I understand. I'm working on it. We have other patients waiting, Miss Whitmore. The woman remained courteous, but firm. "I'm sorry, but we can't hold the slot forever. Please try to make arrangements as soon as possible." The line went dead, and Elise stood in the dim apartment lit only by streetlight filtering through thin curtains. 10 days. She had 10 days to find $180,000 or her sister would die. She'd tried everything. The bank refused a loan because she had no collateral and a poor credit history. She had no relatives to turn to, only an orphan who'd aged out of the system with nothing but her bare hands. Medical charity programs had waiting lists stretching 2 years, and Rosie didn't have 2 years. Rosie had 6 months, maybe less. Her gaze drifted to the black coat draped over the back of a chair. Slowly, she slipped her hand into the pocket and drew out the black card with silver lettering. Ashton Kincaid. Just a name and a phone number. No title, no address, as though the name alone was enough. She knew who he was. She knew the stories, the rumors, the half-written articles that ended abruptly, as if the authors had been warned. Working for him meant stepping into a world she didn't belong to, a world dark and dangerous, where a human life could be measured in money. But then she looked at Rosie again, at the small chest struggling to rise and fall with every breath, and she knew she had no other choice. There are moral lines people swear they'll never cross, until the person they love most is standing at the edge of death. The next morning, when the first pale rays of sunlight slipped through the curtains, Elise picked up her phone and dialed the number on the card. Her heart pounded as it rang once, twice, then clicked. "I was wondering when you'd call." Ashton Kincaid's voice flowed through the line, low and calm, as though he'd anticipated this moment, as though he'd been waiting. "I'll do it," Elise said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'll work for you, but I have a condition." A second of silence then. "Name it." "I need an advance. $180,000 for my sister's surgery." She swallowed and forced herself to continue before courage failed her. "I'll work to pay it back. Every cent, however long it takes." Silence stretched on the other end. Time seemed to stall. Her heart seemed to stop. The world itself seemed to hold its breath waiting for his answer. Then Ashton spoke, his tone as casual as if she'd asked to borrow a few dollars for coffee. "Done. Sterling will pick you up at 5. She stood there, unable to believe what she'd heard. No negotiation, no questions, not a flicker of hesitation. $180,000. Agreed to as if it were loose change in his pocket. As if he'd known all along she would call, known exactly what she needed, arranged everything, and simply waited for her to step into the trap. Elise lowered the phone, her hand trembling. She went to Rosie's bedside and sat down, gazing at the small face still lost in sleep. "I'm going to save you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "No matter what it costs me." At exactly 5 o'clock in the evening, not a minute early, and not a second late, the sleek black SUV pulled up in front of Elise's aging building. Sterling stepped out, his face as expressionless as the first time she'd seen him, and waited beside the rear door like a patient statue. Elise stood on the sidewalk with a small bag slung over her shoulder, holding a few changes of clothes, a handful of personal items, and a small photograph of Rosie that she always kept close. That was everything she owned in this world, and it fit into a bag no larger than a grade school child's satchel. That morning had unfolded in a blur. A private ambulance had arrived to collect Rosie and take her to the best hospital in the city to prepare for surgery. The doctors, who had only recently been pressing her about payment deadlines, had suddenly become remarkably attentive and courteous the moment they heard the name Kincaid. Elise had been allowed to stay with Rosie until she was wheeled into pre-op, and she'd promised her that when she woke up, everything would be different. She just hadn't said that everything would be different for her, too. The vehicle glided past the familiar streets of the South Side, then gradually entered neighborhoods Elise had never set foot in. The houses grew larger, spaced farther apart, the trees more plentiful and meticulously trimmed. This was another Chicago, a Chicago of money and power, where someone like her existed only as help or delivery. The SUV finally stopped before a massive iron gate, at least 3 meters high, its pointed tips like spears standing guard. Security cameras pivoted toward them, and after a moment the gate slowly opened, as if parting its jaws to swallow prey. The Kincaid estate revealed itself, and Elise had to fight the urge to gape. It wasn't a house. It was a fortress. The main structure was built of dark gray stone, 3 stories tall with dozens of high windows like watchful eyes trained on her. The steep roof lay blanketed in snow, tall chimneys exhaling thin streams of smoke. The front grounds stretched wide, perfectly manicured hedges lining a white gravel drive that curved toward the main entrance. The perimeter wall was high and thick, surveillance cameras stationed at every corner, and everywhere she looked, men in black suits stood guard, arms folded, eyes hidden behind dark glasses despite the winter season. Elise stepped out of the vehicle, and the first sensation that washed over her was smallness. She felt like a mouse willingly entering a den of cats, like a moth flying straight into a flame it knew would burn. Sterling led her through enormous oak doors, and the interior proved even more opulent than she'd imagined. Polished marble floors gleamed beneath crystal chandeliers suspended from soaring ceilings. Antique paintings in gilded frames lined the hallways like a private museum. Yet for all its grandeur, a chill seemed to cling to the walls, as though the house had never known the warmth of a true family. "Rules," Sterling said when they stopped midway down the corridor, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "First, don't ask about Mr. Kincaid's business. What he does, who he meets, where he goes. None of that is your concern. Second, don't go to the third floor, ever, for any reason. Third, don't leave the property after 10 p.m. without permission. Are we clear?" Elise nodded, swallowing. "Clear." Sterling studied her a moment as if assessing her worth, then continued on. They passed through a vast kitchen outfitted with modern appliances, where several staff members were at work. When they saw Elise, they paused and looked at her with curiosity tinged with pity, like spectators observing an animal being led to slaughter. An older woman with silver hair and a white apron leaned toward her when Sterling stepped aside to answer his phone. "You're the new caretaker?" she whispered. Elise nodded. The woman looked her up and down, then sighed. "The last one lasted 2 weeks. The one before that, 3 days. Good luck, honey. You're going to need it." Before Elise could ask more, Sterling had returned and escorted her to her room. It was on the second floor, small but clean and more comfortable than anywhere she'd ever lived. A narrow bed with crisp white linens, a wooden wardrobe, a small desk beside a window overlooking the garden. Compared to her dilapidated apartment, it felt almost like heaven. But she knew this heaven came at a cost. That first night, Elise lay in bed unable to sleep. The room was too quiet, too unfamiliar, and her mind refused to rest, circling thoughts of Rosie in the hospital, of what she had willingly stepped into, of the price she might be made to pay. Then a sound beyond the window startled her upright. She rose quietly and parted the curtain just enough to look into the rear garden. Pale moonlight washed over the grounds, and she saw 2 men being escorted out through a side gate by several guards. Their hands were bound behind their backs, black cloth tied over their mouths. What chilled her wasn't the sight itself, but the silence of it. They didn't shout. They didn't struggle. They walked like men who had accepted their fate, like men who understood resistance was pointless. Then they vanished into the darkness, and the garden returned to stillness, as though nothing had happened. Elise stepped back, her heart pounding. She sat on the edge of the bed, clasping her hands together to keep them from shaking. This was Ashton Kincaid's world. This was where she had chosen to step. She wasn't here to judge, she reminded herself. She was here to save Rosie. Just remember that. Just hold on to that. The next morning, Sterling knocked on her door at exactly 7. After she'd made herself presentable, he led her down the corridor toward Maggie's room. But as they reached the head of the staircase, Elise heard footsteps descending from above, slow, deliberate, and somehow threatening. Someone was coming down the stairs, and the air seemed to thicken, as if the entire house were holding its breath in anticipation. The woman descended the staircase like a queen gracing the earth, each step measured for maximum effect. Her long black hair fell over her shoulders like polished silk, her skin flawless and pale, her eyes sharp as twin blades dissecting everything in their path. She wore a fitted black dress so expensive, Elise could guess it cost more than a year of her rent, and red high heels struck the marble floor in crisp echoes that rang through the silent corridor. Sterling stopped at once and inclined his head slightly. Miss Felicity. It was the first time Elise had seen him show even a trace of deference to anyone, and that alone spoke volumes about this woman's place in the family. Felicity halted directly in front of them, blocking the passage like an immovable wall. Her gaze skimmed over Sterling with indifference, then settled on Elise with the calculating interest of a cat studying a mouse that had wandered into its territory. "So," she said, her voice sweet enough that Elise could almost taste the artificiality in it. "You're the new one." Elise stood straight, refusing to lower her eyes or shrink beneath that scorching stare. "I'm here to take care of Mrs. Kincaid." A sharp, brittle laugh slipped from Felicity's lips, the sound cutting through the hallway. "That's what they all say. Every single one of them. I'm here to help. I'm here to care. Until they show their true colors." She stepped closer, and Elise caught the scent of expensive perfume, elegant and distant, much like its wearer. "What do you really want?" Felicity asked, tilting her head as if examining a peculiar insect. "Money? Obviously, judging by those clothes. Or maybe a way into this family. A chance to climb the social ladder by attaching yourself to someone powerful." Her eyes flicked toward the corridor leading to Ashton's study, then back to Elise with a knowing half-smile. "Or maybe my brother. Is that what you're after? Wouldn't be the first time a pretty face tried to catch his attention by pretending to care about our mother." Heat rushed to Elise's face, not from shame but from anger. The indignation of being judged by someone who knew nothing of her life, nothing of what she'd sacrificed, flared inside her. Still, she swallowed it down, reminding herself she was here for Rosie, not to spar with a wealthy heiress. "I want to take care of your mother," she said, her voice calm and clear, "and earn money to save my sister. Nothing more, nothing less. I don't have any hidden agenda, and I certainly have no interest in your brother beyond the professional relationship of employer and employee." Felicity seemed momentarily taken aback by the blunt honesty, but she masked it quickly with an even colder smile. She moved closer still, close enough that Elise could see each perfectly groomed lash framing those cutting eyes. "Everyone who walks through that door has an angle," Felicity said, lowering her voice to a near whisper, each word precise and sharp. "Everyone wants something from us. I've seen gold diggers who thought they could seduce their way into our fortune. I've seen spies sent by competitors hoping to uncover our secrets. I've seen journalists posing as housekeepers trying to get an exclusive story. All of them, every single one, wearing the same innocent face you're wearing right now." She paused, letting the accusation settle. "I'll be watching your every step, every word you say, every move you make, every room you enter. One mistake, one suspicious move, and you're out." She tilted her head again, the smile vanishing until only pure coldness remained. Or worse. Elise knew she should feel afraid. She should step back, lower her gaze, submit the way others surely had. But something inside her, forged through years of hardship, refused to bend. She'd faced hunger, loneliness, the looming loss of the only person she loved. Compared to that, an arrogant socialite wasn't enough to make her tremble. "Then watch," Elise replied, her voice steady. "I have nothing to hide. Watch me every second of every day if it makes you feel better. You'll see exactly what I told you. A woman doing her job and taking care of your mother. Nothing more." Felicity stood still, and for a fleeting second Elise caught a flicker in her cold eyes. Surprise, perhaps even uncertainty. She wasn't accustomed to being answered this way. The others must have feared her, begged, retreated, or run. No one had looked her in the eye and declared they had nothing to conceal. But the moment passed as swiftly as it came. Felicity reclaimed her icy composure and turned down the opposite corridor. Before disappearing, she tossed a final remark over her shoulder, her tone edged with threat and challenge. "We'll see how long that courage lasts." The click of her heels faded into the distance and vanished behind a door at the far end of the hall. Elise remained still, fighting to steady the wild rhythm of her heart. Sterling stood beside her like a shadow, offering no comment on what had just unfolded. "This way, Miss Whitmore," he said after a moment, his voice as neutral as ever. "Mrs. Kincaid's room is at the end of the hall." He moved forward, and Elise followed, though her steps felt heavier now. She passed antique paintings in ornate gold frames, portraits of nobility, and European landscapes she didn't recognize. Crystal chandeliers shimmered overhead, scattering light across the marble floor like 1,000 diamonds. Everything around her was lavish, polished, foreign enough to feel unreal, as though she were walking through a dream, or perhaps a nightmare. She wondered what she had done. Had she stepped into heaven or into hell? Was $180,000 worth living in this house, beneath Felicity's constant scrutiny, within Ashton Kincaid's dark and dangerous world? Then she thought of Rosie lying in the hospital bed, waiting for the surgery that would save her life, and she knew the answer. It was worth it. Whether this place proved heaven or hell, whatever trials awaited her, it was worth it to save her sister. She would endure. She would survive. She would do whatever was necessary. Sterling stopped before an oak door at the end of the corridor, knocked twice, then slowly pushed it open. He gestured for Elise to enter but did not follow, only saying quietly, "I'll be outside if you need anything." Then he stepped back, leaving her to walk in alone. The first thing Elise noticed was how completely different this room felt from the rest of the mansion. If the house itself was a cold fortress of marble and glittering crystal, Maggie's room was a hidden oasis of warmth within it. Soft light from lamps shaded in pale gold fabric cast a gentle glow, like late autumn sunlight settling over everything it touched. The walls were painted a warm cream and covered with family photographs in simple wooden frames. There were black and white wedding portraits, pictures of 2 children playing in a garden, an image of a family of 4 standing before this very estate, when it must have still echoed with laughter. Shelves and tables held antiques, small keepsakes, and carefully arranged vases of fresh flowers. The entire room carried the faint scent of lavender and aged wood, giving the sense of stepping into someone's memory, a place where time slowed and the outside world ceased to exist. Maggie sat in an armchair by the window, her small frame nearly swallowed by a pale blue wool blanket draped across her lap. She did not turn when the door opened, her gaze fixed on the snow-covered garden beyond the glass, as if searching for something long lost. "Who's there?" Her voice trembled, wary and fragile, like a small bird poised to flee at the slightest threat. Elise didn't rush. Years in the orphanage had taught her that trust can't be forced. It must be built slowly, with patience and time. She drew a small chair closer, placing it a few steps away from Maggie, near enough to be seen but far enough not to intrude. "My name is Elise," she said softly, her voice like a light breeze through the room. "I'm here to keep you company, if you'd like." Maggie turned her head slowly. Her eyes, once sharp and intelligent in the photographs, were now clouded and adrift. She looked at Elise as one looks at a stranger, without recognition. "Where's my son?" she asked anxiously. "I want Ashton. Where did he go? He was just here. He was just—" She faltered, confusion deepening the lines in her face. "Or was that yesterday? I can't remember." Elise felt her heart tighten. She'd read about Alzheimer's, understood what it does to a person, but witnessing it was something else entirely. This was a woman who had once been someone, who had once possessed a full life of family and memories, and now she was losing herself piece by piece. "He'll come soon," Elise said gently, unwilling to stir more panic. "But while we wait, maybe we can talk. It's a beautiful view from here. Look at the snow outside, how it covers everything in white." Maggie looked back toward the window, still uncertain but less guarded. "Snow," she repeated, as though grasping for a thought slipping through her fingers. "Yes, it is snowing. It looks so cold out there." "It is cold," Elise agreed, "but also beautiful. The way the light reflects off the snow, making everything sparkle. When I was a little girl, I used to think snow was pieces of stars falling from the sky." A faint spark flickered in Maggie's eyes. "That's a lovely thought," she murmured, her voice steadier now. "Pieces of stars." Elise smiled, and without thinking she began to hum. The song came naturally, like breathing, like a heartbeat. "You are my sunshine, my only sunshine. You make me happy when skies are gray." It was the same song she had sung in the parking lot that night, the song her own mother had once sung before leaving her at the orphanage gates. It was the only thing she had left of the woman who gave her life, and somehow it had become a bridge between her and those who were lost. Maggie's fingers, which had been gripping the arms of her chair, slowly loosened. Her body, tense and drawn tight, began to relax with each note. She turned to Elise, and this time, something different shone in her gaze. A small light, like a candle flickering in darkness. "I know that song," she whispered in wonder. "I know that voice." Elise stopped singing, her heart quickening. She remembered. Somehow, amid the fragments of memory breaking apart, she remembered. "You're the girl," Maggie said, her eyes bright as if someone had flipped a switch inside her. "The girl from the snow. You sang for me when I was lost. You brought me back." Tears filled Elise's eyes, and she didn't try to hide them. "Yes, ma'am," she said, her voice thick. "That was me." Maggie reached out, and Elise took the frail, wrinkled hand in her own. It was cold and trembling, yet when it closed around Elise's fingers, it held with surprising strength. "Don't leave me," Maggie pleaded. her voice like a child's. Please. Everyone leaves. Everyone forgets. Don't leave me alone. Elise knelt beside the chair so their eyes were level. I won't, she said, and she knew it was a promise she intended to keep. I promise. I'm here, and I won't leave. Maggie smiled, the first true smile Elise had seen since entering the room. It was like sunlight breaking through gray clouds, gentle and warm, dissolving the last trace of chill. Neither of them knew that beyond the slightly open door, Ashton stood motionless in the dim corridor. He had paused at the sound of her singing, and remained there, watching through the narrow gap. His mother was smiling. For the first time in months, she was not panicking, not weeping, not calling out the names of the long dead. She was smiling and holding the hand of the girl he had brought into his home only yesterday. Ashton Kincaid, the man who had built an empire on cold calculation and iron resolve, stood there, and for the first time in years, he did not know what to think. Ashton Kincaid's office was on the 3rd floor, the very place Sterling had warned Elise never to set foot. The room was dark as a cavern, heavy black velvet curtains drawn tight against the outside light, leaving only a single desk lamp casting a faint wash of yellow across a massive black oak desk. Shelves climbed to the ceiling, lined with worn leather-bound books and thick files. A map of the city hung on the wall, certain districts marked with red pins. Above the cold fireplace loomed a large oil portrait of a man whose eyes were identical to Ashton's. Watching from another generation, Ashton sat behind his desk, leaning back in a high-backed leather chair, slowly turning a silver fountain pen between his fingers. He had summoned Sterling the moment he left the hallway outside his mother's room, and now his most loyal guard stood before him awaiting instruction. I want everything on her, Ashton said, his voice low and even. Family, background, debts, connections, ex-boyfriends, parking tickets, every place she's ever lived, every job she's ever had. Leave no stone unturned. I want to know everything about Elise Whitmore, down to what brand of toothpaste she uses. Sterling nodded without surprise. It wasn't the first time his employer had ordered an investigation, and it wouldn't be the last. Still, he asked, you think she's a plant? From the Morellis? Ashton didn't answer at once. The pen continued its steady rotation, like the swing of a clock's pendulum. I don't know what she is, he said after a moment. That's the problem. When Sterling left to carry out the order, Ashton leaned back and closed his eyes. In 20 years of running the Kincaid family, he had encountered every kind of person imaginable. Traitors, spies, assassins, men who pledged loyalty while sharpening knives behind his back, smiling faces plotting to strip him of everything he owned. He had learned early, on the night he watched his father murdered by the very man he called brother, that no one performs an act of kindness without expecting something in return. Everyone has a shadow. Everyone has a hidden motive. Everyone has a price. That was the law of the world he lived in, and he had never seen an exception, until she appeared. The thin girl with rain-soaked brown hair and green eyes that didn't flinch beneath his stare. The girl willing to lose her job, her only income, to help a frail stranger in a parking lot. The girl who sang to his mother with a voice clear as running water and coaxed from her a smile that hadn't surfaced in months. What did she want? Money. He had given her money, more than she asked, and she had seemed almost uncomfortable accepting it. Power. She hadn't been dazzled or seduced by his name the way others were. A place in his family. She had refused to work for him at first, even though desperation had been written plainly across her circumstances. So what was she? Sterling returned hours later carrying a thin file. That alone was telling. Reports on those Ashton investigated were usually thick as a brick. Elise Whitmore, Sterling began, reading. Orphaned at 5. Mother left her at St. Catherine's Orphanage on the south side, with no explanation, and never returned. No record of a father. Likely the mother didn't know who he was. Lived in the orphanage until 18, then aged out. He turned a page. Adopted a child named Rosie from the same orphanage when the girl was 2, legally registered as guardian. The child has a congenital heart condition. No one else would take her. Elise worked 3 jobs simultaneously for 9 years to support her sister and pay medical bills. No criminal record. No outstanding debts beyond medical expenses awaiting payment. No known ties to any organization, legal or otherwise. Sterling closed the file. She's clean, boss. Cleaner than anyone we've ever vetted. Ashton was silent for a long moment. He rose and walked to the window, pulling back a corner of the curtain to look down at the snow-covered garden. Clean, he repeated softly. Or too clean. Maybe she's exactly what she appears to be. Just a girl trying to save her sister. Isn't that a good thing? Sterling asked. Ashton didn't answer. In his world, true innocence was more dangerous than betrayal. A traitor could be anticipated, manipulated, crushed. Their motives could be studied, their weaknesses exploited. But a person who was genuinely good, genuinely unguarded, with no shadow to leverage and no hunger to control, left him without a strategy, and that unsettled him. One more thing, boss, Sterling added, his tone lowering. The Morellis. They've been quiet lately. Too quiet. Our sources inside say they're planning something big, but no one knows what. They haven't made a move against us in 3 months, and that's not their style. Ashton turned, his eyes narrowing. The Morelli family had been their greatest rival for decades. Silence from them didn't mean peace. It meant preparation. Double the perimeter guards, he ordered. Increase security around my mother's room, and keep an eye on the new girl. Sterling lifted a brow. You don't trust her? It's not about trust, Ashton replied. If the Morellis discover how much my mother responds to her, if they realize she's the first person in years who can truly calm her, she becomes a target. I'm not protecting her from us. I'm protecting her from them. Sterling nodded and left to carry out the instructions. Ashton remained alone in the dim office, the desk lamp carving sharp lines across his features. On the desk beside stacks of paperwork lay a small silver-framed photograph. His mother, taken years ago when she had still been strong and clear-minded, smiling into the camera. He picked it up, his thumb brushing lightly over the glass. Who are you, Elise Whitmore? He murmured into the darkness. And why can't I figure you out? The days inside the Kincaid estate began to settle into a rhythm of their own, like a piece of music rewritten with new notes. Elise quickly realized that Maggie needed stability, familiar routines to anchor her drifting mind to the present. And so she began building those routines, slowly and patiently, like a mason laying bricks one by one. Each morning, after helping Maggie with breakfast and her medication, they would sit by the large window overlooking the garden and listen to classical music. Elise discovered Maggie's old record collection, tucked away in a cabinet, albums from the 1950s and 60s she had kept her entire life. When the music played, Maggie would sometimes close her eyes and begin telling stories of her youth, of dances beneath glittering lights, of the first time she met her husband, of summer nights under the Chicago sky when the city had felt like a different place altogether. The stories drifted in and out like clouds, sometimes vivid and sharp, sometimes broken and faint, yet Elise listened with the kind of attention one gives to priceless treasures. At noon, if the weather allowed, Elise would wheel Maggie through the winter garden. Snow had begun to melt in patches, revealing tender shoots waiting for spring, and Maggie liked to point at certain corners and speak of flowers she once planted there. In return, Elise told her about Rosie, about her small sister slowly recovering after surgery, about the letters and drawings she received from the hospital each day. Maggie listened with genuine interest. Sometimes she remembered who Rosie was. Sometimes she forgot, but she always smiled when Elise spoke of her. Afternoons were for photo albums. Maggie owned an entire cabinet of them, and they would sit together on the soft sofa, turning each page slowly. Through those photographs, Elise began to understand the Kincaid family more deeply. There was Maggie's wedding, standing beside a tall man with a warm smile and eyes identical to Ashton's. There was Ashton as a boy, dark-haired and bright-eyed, holding a stray cat he had found on the street. There was Felicity in a ballerina dress, poised on a small school stage. And then Maggie paused at a particular photograph, her trembling finger resting on the image of a young woman with brown hair and a radiant smile. "That's me," she said proudly. 1975. I was a singer, you know. Not famous, nothing like that. But I had a voice. I sang at clubs downtown, little places where people came to listen and dance. Elise studied the photograph, then looked back at Maggie. She could still see traces of that youthful beauty in the lines time had drawn across her face. "I can tell," Elise said softly. "Your voice is still beautiful, Mrs. Kincaid." Maggie smiled and, to Elise's surprise, suggested, "Shall I teach you a song? One of my favorites." And so instead of Elise singing as she usually did, Maggie began teaching her songs from her younger days. Melodies from the 1960s and 70s Elise had never heard. Nostalgic tunes carrying the weight of memory. "This one is Moon River," Maggie said one afternoon as pale sunlight filtered through the window. "My husband used to request it every night. He said my voice sounded like moonlight when I sang it." Then she began to sing, her voice trembling with age, yet still true to every note, still filled with the depth of someone who had lived inside that song 1,000 times. Elise listened, then tried to follow along, and laughter filled the room when she missed a note. Word of Maggie's transformation spread quickly through the estate. Staff members whispered when they heard singing or laughter drifting from her room. "She's different, that new girl," the cook told a housekeeper. "Mrs. Kincaid actually remembers her name. She asks for her every morning. 'Where's Elise? Tell Elise to come.'" But Maggie's memory was not always kind. One afternoon, as they turned the pages of an album, Maggie suddenly gripped Elise's hand, her eyes lighting with something intense and unfamiliar. "Lillian?" she breathed, her voice full of hope and love. "Lillian, you're home. I've missed you so much." Elise felt a sharp ache in her chest. "I'm Elise, ma'am," she said gently, unwilling to lie, yet careful not to wound. "Not Lillian." The light in Maggie's eyes dimmed, replaced by a deep sorrow. "Oh," she whispered, tears gathering. Of course you're not. But you look so much like her. My Lillian. She had your eyes." Later, when Maggie had fallen asleep, Elise sought out Sterling. "Who was Lillian?" she asked quietly. Sterling studied her for a long moment, weighing how much to reveal. At last he answered simply, "Lillian was Mrs. Kincaid's daughter, the youngest. She died 20 years ago. Car accident. We don't talk about it." Elise understood then. She understood the grief woven into the walls of this house, the reason it felt so cold, despite its grandeur. This family had lost too much, and mourned too long, until emptiness had become their native language. That evening, Elise sat beside Maggie's bed as usual, and Maggie asked to hear Moon River again. This time she didn't merely listen. She sang with Elise, their voices weaving together, one young and one aged, yet both carrying the same longing to belong, to be loved, to be remembered. Outside the slightly open door, Ashton stood in the corridor's shadows. He had been on his way to his office when the sound of singing reached him, and he had stopped without thinking. His mother's voice floated out, clearer than he had heard in years, blending with the voice of the girl he still couldn't decipher. And for the first time in so long, he had nearly forgotten the feeling. He found himself smiling. Inside the room, the song ended, and Maggie drifted into sleep with a peaceful smile upon her lips. Elise gently tucked the blanket around her, brushed a silver strand of hair from her forehead, and remained there a little longer to be certain she was resting comfortably. She didn't know that beyond the door Ashton had stood watching for quite some time, and for the first time in 20 years he allowed himself to wonder whether someone in this world might truly be good. 2 weeks passed, and with each day Felicity's irritation grew like a slow burning ember inside her. She heard the whispers among the staff in the kitchen, in the corridors, in the quiet corners of the estate. They spoke about Maggie, about how she seemed brighter, more lucid, even humming old songs again. They spoke about the new girl, about how she had changed the atmosphere of the mistress's room, about how Mrs. Kincaid actually remembered her name and asked for her every morning. Felicity didn't believe it, or rather, she refused to. How could a nameless girl from nowhere accomplish what she, Maggie's own daughter, could not? How could a mother who sometimes failed to recognize her own child remember the name of a stranger? It wasn't fair. It couldn't be real. There had to be something beneath it, an angle, a hidden motive she simply hadn't uncovered yet. One afternoon, Felicity decided to see for herself. She walked down the corridor with determined steps, her heels striking the marble like the beat of a war drum, and pushed open Maggie's door without knocking. Inside, Elise sat behind Maggie, gently brushing her silver hair with an antique ivory comb. The two were speaking softly, and when the door opened, they both turned. Elise rose at once. Maggie simply smiled. "Felicity," she said, and Felicity's heart skipped when she heard her mother speak her name correctly. "You've come to visit me." But Felicity hadn't come to visit. She had come to fight, to prove something, though she wasn't entirely sure what. She stepped closer, her gaze sweeping over Elise with undisguised disdain before settling on her mother. "Mother?" she said, her voice sweet to the point of falseness, though her eyes were hard as steel. "Do you know who this girl really is?" Maggie looked at her, confusion flickering across her face. "This is Elise," she answered slowly. "She takes care of me. She sings for me." Felicity let out a sharp laugh. "She's being paid to be here, Mother. She doesn't actually care about you. She's just another employee, like the gardener, like the cook. She's here for money, not because she loves you." The room fell silent. Elise stood with the comb still in her hand, but she said nothing in her own defense. She understood that anything she offered would be twisted, reshaped into proof of whatever accusation Felicity wished to make. Silence was better. Let Maggie decide for herself. Felicity pressed on, her tone sharpening. "How do you know she's not after our money? Our family? She came from nowhere and has nothing. Doesn't that make you suspicious? Doesn't that make you wonder what she really wants?" She waited for outrage, waited for her mother to see reason, to stand up, to dismiss this girl. Waited to be proven right. What came instead was worse than any argument. Maggie did not defend Elise. She did not scold Felicity either. She simply turned her face toward the window and looked out as though her daughter no longer existed, as though the words Felicity had spoken were unworthy of response. That silence weighed heavier than any rebuke. Felicity stood frozen, feeling the blood drain from her face. Her mother did not shout, did not argue. She simply refused to look at her, as if Felicity's presence did not merit acknowledgement. "Mother," Felicity called, her voice trembling despite her effort to steady it. "Mother, look at me." But Maggie continued to gaze at the drifting clouds outside, as though they were the only thing in the world worth seeing. Elise watched and felt her heart ache, not because of the insults hurled at her, but because she understood the pain beneath Felicity's anger. Felicity didn't hate her. Felicity was jealous, wounded, desperate for recognition from a mother who was slowly forgetting her. And now that mother was turning away because of a stranger. "I'll give you two some privacy," Elise said softly, placing the comb down. She moved past Felicity without meeting her eyes, without triumph or contempt. She simply left, allowing mother and daughter to remain in the room with the invisible wall between them. In the hallway, Elise leaned back against the cold wall, closed her eyes, and drew a slow breath. Tears threatened, not from humiliation, but from sorrow. She almost wept for Maggie, a mother trapped inside a failing mind, caught between children she loved but no longer knew how to love. She wept for Felicity, a woman clearly in pain who only knew how to express it as anger. And she wept for herself, standing in the middle of a fractured family she did not belong to, trying to mend pieces she had never broken. That night, Felicity was summoned to Ashton's office on the 3rd floor. No one knew what passed between brother and sister in that dark room. No one heard the words exchanged, but when Felicity emerged 30 minutes later, her eyes were red and swollen as though she had cried hard. She walked quickly down the corridor without looking at anyone, and the slam of her bedroom door echoed through the quiet house. After that, Felicity no longer came to Maggie's room. That morning began like any other, with pale winter sunlight filtering through gray clouds and a thin sheet of snow still clinging to the ground. Elise was pushing Maggie's wheelchair along the narrow garden path, where the first hints of spring were daring to break through melting frost. Maggie was speaking about the garden in summertime, about the roses she once tended, about the laughter of children racing across bright green lawns, when the phone in Elise's pocket began to vibrate. She glanced at the screen, and her heart quickened at the sight of the hospital's number. For weeks she had called daily for updates about Rosie, but this was the first time the hospital had called her. And in the world of those with loved ones lying in hospital beds, an unexpected call is rarely good news. "Hello?" she answered, her voice unsteady. "Miss Whitmore?" The doctor's voice came through the line, and Elise held her breath. "I'm calling with news about Rosie. The surgery was completed this morning." A pause, brief yet stretching like an eternity. "It was a success. She's in recovery now, and all signs indicate she's going to be okay. She's expected to make a full recovery." Elise stood frozen in the snow-covered garden, the phone pressed to her ear though she no longer heard the rest. The words echoed in her mind like church bells, like the most beautiful music she had ever known. Rosie would live. Her sister would live. Tears spilled down her cheeks without permission, unstoppable. She wept there beneath winter light and fading snow, wept from relief, from joy, from the release of years spent fighting a battle she had finally won. "What's wrong, dear?" Maggie's voice rose from the wheelchair, filled with concern. "Bad news?" Elise turned, tears blurring her vision, and saw Maggie's lined face watching her with genuine worry. She shook her head, a radiant smile breaking through her tears. Good news, she whispered thickly. The best news. My sister. She's going to live. She's going to be okay. Maggie reached for her hand and squeezed gently. That's wonderful, dear. That's the most wonderful thing. Elise knelt beside the chair and embraced her, and Maggie patted her back the way a mother soothes a child. They remained there for a moment. Two women from different worlds sharing simple happiness in a winter garden. After settling Maggie comfortably back in her room, Elise called the hospital again to ask about details. And that was when she received the second shock of the day, one that nearly stole her breath. Regarding the bill, the woman from finance said politely, "It's been paid in full, ma'am, all $200,000. In addition, a private recovery suite and full post-operative care have been arranged. Everything has been taken care of." Elise felt as though something had struck her square in the chest. "That's not possible," she said. "Our agreement was just an advance. I was supposed to repay it. I was supposed to—" Mr. Kincaid handled everything personally," the woman interrupted. "He called 2 days ago and cleared all outstanding balances. Is there anything else I can assist you with?" Elise ended the call without remembering whether she had said goodbye. Her mind spun with questions and conflicting emotions. Before she had fully thought it through, her feet carried her to the 3rd floor, to the door of Ashton's office. She pushed it open without knocking, something she had never dared before. Ashton sat behind his desk, signing papers beneath the dim glow of his lamp. He looked up as she entered, a flicker of surprise crossing his features before his usual composure returned. "Why did you pay everything?" Elise demanded, her voice sharper than she intended in the shadowed room. "That wasn't our deal. I was supposed to repay every cent." Ashton did not answer immediately. He lowered his gaze and continued signing the document as if she were not standing there. "Consider it an investment," he said evenly. "You work better when you're not distracted by worry. My mother needs you focused, not burdened by money." "I don't want charity," Elise replied, stepping closer. "I don't want to owe you more than I can repay. I don't want to be—" She faltered, unable to find the words. She didn't want to feel indebted, bound, as though she had traded her soul for salvation. Ashton stopped writing. Slowly he lifted his head, and for the first time since she had entered, he truly looked at her. His gray eyes were not as cold as usual. There was something else there, something quieter, softer. "Then repay me by staying," he said slowly, "by taking care of my mother, by being exactly who you are." Silence stretched between them, heavy yet not uncomfortable. Elise felt as though she were seeing the real Ashton Kincaid for the first time. Not the calculating leader, not the powerful man whose name carried fear, but a son trying, in the only way he knew, to do something right. He wasn't granting her a favor. He was trusting her. Then Ashton asked, his voice unexpectedly gentler, "Your sister, Rosie, what is she like?" Elise blinked, surprised. He had never asked about her life beyond Maggie's care. "She's 8, she said after a moment, and a smile formed instinctively at the thought of Rosie. "Stubborn, brave, so brave. She doesn't complain about the pain, never has. She just keeps fighting, every single day." Ashton studied her, and the faintest shadow of a smile touched his lips. "Sounds like someone else I know." Elise felt warmth rush to her face and lowered her eyes to hide her reaction. "Thank you," she said softly. "I won't forget this. Ever." She turned and left, the door closing with a quiet click behind her. Ashton remained seated, staring at the closed door, the pen motionless in his hand. For the first time in his life he had given without expecting anything in return, and for the first time, it did not make him feel weak. It made him feel as though something long dormant within him had begun to stir. There are days when an Alzheimer's patient becomes strangely lucid, as though the fog that has settled over the mind suddenly lifts and reveals the clear light of memory beneath. Doctors call them crystal clear days, rare and precious hours when the patient seems to return to themselves, speaking coherently, remembering details, recognizing the faces around them. No one knows why such days come, nor how long they will last. They arrive like unexpected gifts and vanish like dreams dissolving at dawn. That day was one of those days for Maggie. From early morning, Elise sensed the difference. Maggie's eyes were brighter, sharper, no longer clouded and adrift. She greeted Elise by name the moment she entered the room, asked about Rosie, and remembered that the surgery had been successful. She even recalled something from the previous day, which on ordinary afternoons would have slipped through her grasp. By late afternoon, they sat beside the large window overlooking the garden. The snow was receding, exposing dark patches of earth and the first brave hints of green. Sunlight filtered through the glass, casting warm gold across the wooden floor and the wool blanket resting over Maggie's knees. They sat quietly for a while before Maggie spoke, her voice clear and steady in a way Elise rarely heard. "Ashton wasn't always like this, you know," she said, still gazing outside. Cold, guarded, building walls around himself like a fortress. He was the gentlest boy when he was young, the gentlest, sweetest child you could imagine. Elise remained still, afraid even to shift in her seat, worried any movement might shatter the fragile clarity of the moment. "When he was little," Maggie continued, a nostalgic smile touching her lips, "he used to bring home injured birds, stray cats, anything that needed saving. He would find them in the park, on the street, behind the school, and carry them home in his small hands, begging me to help. He had the softest heart. He cried every time one of them didn't survive." The smile faded, replaced by something heavier. Then his father was killed. Ashton was 15. He saw it happen. Elise felt her chest tighten. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, though the words felt painfully inadequate. Maggie turned toward her, eyes filled with the weight of a lifetime. "His father's own business partner did it," she said quietly but clearly. "A man we trusted. A man who dined at our table, who held Ashton as a baby, who called my husband brother. He smiled at us on Sunday, and by Wednesday he had put a bullet in my husband's chest." Elise had known the Kincaid world was dangerous, shadowed by violence and betrayal, but hearing it from Maggie's own lips was something entirely different. "After that," Maggie went on, her voice distant as though she were watching the past unfold before her, "Ashton had to become a man overnight. He was only 15, still a child, but suddenly he had to take over the family, protect me, protect his sister, protect everything his father built. He didn't have time to grieve, no time to be afraid or angry or heartbroken. He just had to be strong." She closed her eyes briefly, as if holding back tears. "He built walls around his heart after that. High walls, thick walls, so no one could ever hurt him the way that man hurt us. He stopped bringing home stray animals. He stopped crying. He stopped letting anyone close. He became the man you see now, cold and untouchable, because that was the only way he knew how to survive." Silence settled over the room, broken only by the ticking clock and the faint wind beyond the window. Then Maggie turned to Elise, and her eyes gleamed with unusual clarity, as if she perceived something others could not. "But walls that keep out pain also keep out love," she said softly, "and I've watched my son live like that for 20 years. Alone. Safe, but terribly alone." She reached for Elise's hand and squeezed it gently. "You're the first person he hasn't pushed away in 20 years. Do you know why?" Elise shook her head, her pulse quickening. "No, ma'am." Maggie smiled, wise and tender. "Because you don't want anything from him. Everyone else who comes to him wants something. Money, power, protection, favors. But you just want to care for an old woman and save your little sister. You have no hidden agenda, no secret plan, and he doesn't know what to do with that." She tilted her head, a hint of playfulness in her gaze. "It frightens him more than any enemy ever could. He can fight enemies, outsmart rivals, destroy anyone who threatens him. But he doesn't know how to defend himself against genuine kindness. He doesn't know how to handle someone who is simply good." Heat rose to Elise's face, leaving her uncertain how to respond. Maggie chuckled softly and added in a conspiratorial whisper, "He watches you, you know, when you're with me. He stands outside the door and listens to you sing. He thinks I don't notice, thinks I'm too confused to realize he's there. But a mother always notices." Elise's heart stumbled in her chest. She remembered the faint sense of being observed, the shadow beyond the door, the quiet footsteps pausing before retreating. "He's been alone for so long," Maggie murmured. "I worry what will happen to him when I'm gone. Who will care for him? Who will remind him he's still human, that he still has a heart?" Her grip tightened. "Promise me you'll stay, Elise. Promise me you won't leave him alone." Elise didn't know what she felt. Fear, hesitation, or something warmer and more dangerous that she dared not name. She simply nodded, unsure she could trust her own voice. And from that day on, Whenever she sang for Maggie, she could not help but think of the man who might be standing beyond the door, listening in silence, hiding the heart of a boy who once carried wounded birds home in his hands. It was late when Elise finished the last song for Maggie. The older woman had drifted off halfway through Moon River, her breathing slow and even, a faint smile still resting on her lips, as if the melody had followed her gently into sleep. Elise pulled the blanket up around her shoulders, turned off the brighter lamps, and left only the small bedside light casting a warm amber glow across the room, then quietly rose and moved toward the door. She eased it open and stepped into the hallway, only to stop as if the floor had turned to stone beneath her feet. Ashton was standing there, directly outside the door, not hidden in shadow, not pretending he had simply been passing by. He was waiting for her. Maggie's words from earlier that afternoon echoed in Elise's mind. He watches you. He stands outside the door and listens to you sing. Her heart began to beat faster, but she kept her voice steady. You're still here, she said, a hint of surprise slipping through. Ashton looked at her, and in the dim hallway light, his gray eyes seemed deeper, softer than they ever did in daylight. I couldn't sleep, he replied. Then after a brief pause, he asked, his voice low and quiet. Walk with me? Elise didn't know why. She nodded. Perhaps exhaustion had lowered her defenses. Perhaps Maggie's stories had shifted something inside her. Or perhaps she simply didn't want to return to her room alone in the heavy stillness of the night. They walked side by side down the long corridor, their footsteps muted against the marble floor. Wall sconces cast a subdued glow, stretching long shadows across stone and plaster. The mansion at night felt different, quieter, almost intimate, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. The silence between them was not uncomfortable but strangely gentle, as if neither felt compelled to fill it. Eventually Ashton spoke, his tone measured and low. Your family, he said. What happened to them? Elise wasn't surprised. She knew he had investigated her. She knew somewhere in his office there was a file that held the outline of her life. But a file and a confession were not the same thing, and she understood the difference. My mother left me at the gate of St. Catherine's orphanage when I was 5, she said evenly, as if recounting someone else's story. No explanation. No note. She just walked away and never came back. I waited for her for years. Every time someone arrived at the orphanage, I would run to the window thinking it was her. It never was. They passed a tall window where moonlight spilled across the floor in a pale silver band. Rosie was born at the orphanage, Elise continued. Her mother was barely 17 and died giving birth. No father, no relatives. And because Rosie was sick from the beginning, born with a heart that didn't work the way it should, no one wanted to adopt her. She was 2 years old, and no one wanted her. She paused, swallowing against the tightness in her throat. So I chose her. I was 16, still a child myself, but I looked at that tiny girl with her wide eyes and fragile heart, and I knew she was my family. Ashton listened without interrupting, slowing his steps to remain beside her. You raised her alone? He asked. There was no one else. 4 simple words carrying 9 years of exhaustion, 3 jobs at once, sleepless nights, and constant fear of bills that never stopped coming. And you never gave up? Ashton asked, something unfamiliar threading through his voice. Perhaps curiosity. Perhaps something close to admiration. You never thought about making your life easier? Elise stopped and turned to face him. In the wash of moonlight, his features looked sharper, shadows accentuating the angles of his jaw and the intensity of his gaze. She's not a burden, Elise said firmly. She's my reason. My reason to wake up every morning. My reason to keep fighting when everything feels hopeless. She drew in a steady breath. When I was a child, no one chose me. No one looked at me and said, I want her. I'll take care of her. But I had a choice when it came to Rosie. And I chose her. That's what family is. It's not blood. It's choosing each other. Silence fell again, but this time it felt heavier, more meaningful. Ashton studied her, and Elise sensed he was seeing her not as an employee or caretaker, but as a person standing before him in truth. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of 20 years. I was 15 when I had to become this, he said, staring past her as though the past stood in the hallway with them. I watched my father die. One moment he was smiling at me, and the next, his jaw tightened. I held my mother while she screamed. I watched my sister cry until she had nothing left, and I swore, standing over my father's body, that I would never let anyone hurt us again. Elise felt the ache of it in her chest. Maggie's story from earlier now had flesh and breath and memory behind it. But somewhere along the way, Ashton continued quietly, I forgot how to feel anything else. I forgot how to trust, how to let anyone close. He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. Elise understood. She understood walls. She understood loneliness disguised as strength. They stood facing one another, and somehow the distance between them had narrowed. You're stronger than you look, Elise Whitmore, Ashton said, and there was warmth in his voice that she had never heard before. She met his gaze, and her reply came before she could censor it. So are you, Ashton Kincaid. Stronger than you let anyone see. They lingered a moment longer before parting at the staircase. Ashton ascended toward the 3rd floor and his dark office. Elise descended toward her room on the 2nd floor. But after a few steps, both of them turned back at the same time. Their eyes met in the dimness of the stairwell, and for one fleeting instant, there were no walls, no guarded distance, no past standing between them. There were only two people who had grown accustomed to solitude, unexpectedly finding one another in the quiet heart of the night. A week had passed since that night, and spring was beginning to press gently against the edges of Chicago. The snow receded day by day, revealing tender strips of green grass and the first shy shoots pushing up through the thawing earth. The air felt warmer now, carrying the scent of damp soil and early blossoms. The first birds had returned, their songs spilling into the garden like a quiet symphony welcoming the morning. That day, for the first time in weeks, Elise decided to take Maggie outside. The older woman was stronger than she had been when Elise first arrived, and the soft spring sunlight would do her good, in body and in spirit. Sterling had agreed after a thorough security sweep, and the guards had been doubled around the perimeter as Ashton had previously ordered. Elise pushed Maggie's wheelchair along the narrow white gravel path, passing flower beds where the earliest blooms were beginning to open. Maggie tilted her face toward the sun, a peaceful smile resting on her lips. She was lucid enough today to recognize her surroundings and enjoy the walk, though not as crystal clear as the afternoon she had spoken of the past. I used to spend hours in this garden, Maggie said, her voice touched with nostalgia. When the children were small, we played hide-and-seek behind the hedges, and I planted so many flowers. She gestured toward a nearby bed. Roses there, red ones. They were my husband's favorite, and lilies by the fountain. She paused, her gaze drifting. Lillian loved the lilies. That's why we named her that, my little Lily. Elise listened and slowed her pace, giving Maggie time to take in each corner of the garden. She had learned how precious these moments were, when Maggie could remember, could speak, could inhabit the present instead of wandering the broken corridors of memory. The air was calm. Birds sang. A gentle breeze carried the fragrance of new grass and blossoms. Elise felt at peace, perhaps for the first time since stepping into this mansion. She thought of Rosie recovering in the hospital, of Maggie smiling beneath the sun, of this strange new life that no longer felt quite as frightening. She even thought of Ashton, of that night in the hallway, of the way their eyes had met in the dark. Then the world shattered. A sharp crack tore through the quiet, and a bullet slammed into the tree less than a yard from them, splintering bark into the air. 1 second of silence followed. Just one, but it stretched like an eternity. Then came screaming from somewhere inside the mansion, the thunder of running footsteps, the piercing wail of alarms. Elise didn't think. She didn't have time to think. Her body moved on instinct, on something forged through years of hardship. She shoved the wheelchair hard toward the nearest stone wall where an overhang created partial cover. Then she dropped to her knees and wrapped herself around Maggie, covering the older woman's head and shoulders with her own body, becoming a living shield. "Stay down," she shouted, her voice carrying authority she didn't know she possessed. "Don't move." A second shot rang out. Somewhere in the distance, glass shattered from the greenhouse. Maggie trembled in her arms, confusion and terror clouding her eyes. "What's happening?" she whispered. "Ashton! Where's Ashton? I want my son." "Shh," Elise murmured, her tone steady though her heart pounded violently in her chest. "I'm here. I've got you. No one is going to hurt you. I promise." She held Maggie tighter, covering her head and neck completely. If another bullet came, it would have to pass through her first. She didn't frame it as bravery. She simply knew she would not allow harm to come to this woman who had become family in a way she never expected. Footsteps pounded closer. Sterling appeared first, gun drawn, followed by the black-suited security team moving into formation. They created a protective perimeter around Elise and Maggie, scanning the garden and surrounding buildings. "Status," Sterling barked into his radio. A crackling voice responded. "Shooter spotted. Northeast building, 3rd floor. Team Alpha, moving in." Minutes crawled by, heavy and suffocating. Elise stayed wrapped around Maggie, barely breathing. The older woman had stopped shaking, and now clung to her like a frightened child seeking shelter. Then Sterling's voice came again, flat but relieved. "All clear. Target secured." Elise exhaled but didn't release Maggie. She continued to stroke her back, whispering reassurances. "It's over. You're safe. Everything's okay." Sterling knelt beside them. "Shooters in custody," he reported quietly. "Morelli men. They weren't trying to kill. The shots were aimed to miss. They were sending a message." Elise lifted her head. She didn't fully understand the machinery of that world, but she understood enough. This wasn't an assassination. It was a warning. Proof that the Morelli family could reach the Kincaids whenever they chose. Rapid footsteps sounded behind them, and then Ashton appeared. He ran across the garden, ignoring the guards, ignoring Sterling, his eyes fixed on only one thing: his mother, and the woman shielding her. He stopped several paces away. His face had drained of color, his breathing uneven as though he had run miles. His gaze took in the sight before him. Elise, kneeling in the dirt and grass, clothing smeared with mud, arms wrapped around Maggie as if she would absorb a bullet herself before allowing it to touch the older woman. Ashton stood there, and for the first time in his life, he had no words. In 20 years of ruling his empire, he had seen loyalty bought with money, secured with fear, enforced with power. He had never seen someone from outside his world willingly place themselves in harm's way for his family, with nothing to gain but the safety of another human being. Finally he spoke, and his voice trembled in a way Sterling had never heard in 2 decades at his side. "Are you hurt?" Night had long since fallen, wrapping the Kincaid estate in a dense darkness, broken only by the harsh glow of security lights blazing across the garden. After the attack, security had been tripled. Guards stood at every corner. Cameras swept back and forth without rest. Maggie had been returned to her room and soothed to sleep after the private doctor examined her and confirmed she had suffered no injury beyond shock. She had been given a mild sedative and now slept peacefully, unaware of the storm still moving through the house beyond her door. Elise sat in her own room by the window, staring out at the garden where only hours earlier she had nearly died. From here she could see the stone wall where she had shielded Maggie, the tree trunk marked by the deep scar of a bullet, the white gravel path now patrolled by dark figures carrying rifles. Her hands still trembled despite her effort to steady them. The surge of adrenaline had not fully faded. Each time she closed her eyes, she heard the crack of the gunshot again, and felt the moment her heart seemed to stop as the bullet struck the tree. She had almost died. For the first time in her life, she had faced death directly. And the strangest part was that she had not thought about herself at all. She had thought only of Maggie, of protecting her, of refusing to let harm touch the woman who had become family in a way she had never anticipated. A knock sounded at the door, pulling her from her thoughts. Before she could answer, the door opened, and Ashton stepped inside. He did not wait for permission. He did not ask. He simply entered as if it were his right. And perhaps in this house, it was. He stood in the center of the room, still wearing the suit from the emergency security meeting. His tie had been loosened, and his normally immaculate dark hair was slightly disordered, as if he had run his hands through it repeatedly in frustration. His jaw was tight. In his gray eyes burned a fire Elise had never seen before. "You could have been killed." His voice was low and dangerous, each word dropping with weight. Yet Elise understood immediately that the anger was not directed at her. It was aimed inward, at himself, at the fact that his enemies had reached into his territory and threatened his family. So could she. Elise answered calmly. Ashton stepped closer. She saw the muscle along his jaw twitch. "She's my mother," he said. "She's my responsibility, my burden. But you—" He stopped, searching for the right words. "You're an employee. You're paid to care for her, not to die for her. Why would you risk your life like that?" Elise rose from the chair and faced him. She remembered the night they had walked the hallway together, the question about Rosie and why she never gave up. She gave him the same truth now. "Because family isn't just blood," she said, holding his gaze without hesitation. "Family is who you choose to protect, the people you would die for without thinking." Your mother has become that for me. I don't know when it happened, but it did." Ashton stood motionless, as if her words had struck him physically. For several seconds he simply stared at her. Eyes widened in a way that suggested he had heard something entirely foreign. The silence between them grew thick, with everything left unsaid. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a faint tremor she had never heard before. "No one has ever done that for us. Not without wanting something in return. Not without a hidden angle or a price to be paid later. In 20 years, no one has risked their life for my family just because they cared." He swallowed. She saw the movement in his throat. "Just because they chose to. Then you've been surrounded by the wrong people your whole life," Elise said gently. He took a step toward her, then another, and another, until he stood so close she could smell the faint trace of expensive cologne mixed with the subtle scent of stress from a relentless day. She could see the pulse beating at his temple. She could feel the warmth radiating from him. Her own heart began to race, and she could not tell whether it was fear or something far more dangerous. The air between them felt charged, heavy with restrained emotion. For a moment she was certain he would say something more, do something more. But Ashton closed his eyes and drew a slow breath, as if forcing himself back under control. When he opened them, the fire had dimmed. In its place was something softer, sadder. "Thank you, Elise," he said quietly, "for everything." He stepped back, restoring distance between them, and turned toward the door. Elise remained where she stood, unsure whether she should speak. At the threshold, he paused. He did not turn around, but his shoulders were tense, as if weighing a decision. "From now on," he said into the still room, "you have my protection, not as an employee." He paused briefly. When he continued, there was something in his voice she could not fully decipher, as something else. Then he walked out, the door closing with a soft click that echoed in the silence. Elise stood alone, her hand drifting unconsciously to her chest where her heart still pounded. "Something else," she whispered. The words lingered in the empty space like a promise, like a question, like a possibility she was almost afraid to imagine. She stood there for a long time staring at the closed door and realized that what she felt for Ashton Kincaid was no longer simple gratitude or respect. It was something deeper, stronger, more dangerous. Something she should not allow herself to feel. But her heart had never been very good at obeying reason. Several days after the shooting, the Kincaid mansion remained wrapped in a suffocating tension. Security had been tightened to an almost oppressive degree. Guards stood at every corner. No one left the property without Ashton's direct permission. Elise spent most of her hours beside Maggie, singing softly, reading aloud, telling gentle stories, doing everything she could to keep the older woman calm and untouched by the violence that had rippled through the estate. But one afternoon, while Maggie napped, Elise slipped into the library in search of a moment of quiet for herself. The room was vast, lined with shelves that reached the ceiling. Soft light filtered through stained glass windows, and the scent of aged paper and polished oak created a stillness that felt like stepping into another world. She settled into a wingback chair by the window, a book open across her lap about music therapy for patients with Alzheimer's disease. She had found it among the medical volumes and wanted to learn more, to do better, to help Maggie in every way she could. Light footsteps sounded at the doorway. When Elise looked up, she almost did not recognize the woman standing there. Felicity entered the library, but not as the polished figure Elise had come to expect. There were no sharp heels, no flawless makeup, no designer dress. Instead, she wore a loose gray sweater, simple jeans, her dark hair tied back, her face bare and revealing shadows beneath her eyes, and a fatigue etched deep into her features. She looked like an ordinary woman carrying something far too heavy. "Can we talk?" Felicity asked. Her voice was no longer sharp. It was softer, lower, carrying an ache Elise could not immediately name. Elise nodded and closed her book, placing it on the table beside her chair. She waited in silence. Felicity stepped further in and took the seat opposite her. She did not look at Elise at first, her gaze lingering on a landscape painting as if searching for the right words. The quiet stretched between them, broken only by the ticking of an antique clock and the faint wind brushing against the slightly open window. At last, Felicity spoke. "I saw what you did," she said slowly. "In the garden, when the shots were fired." Elise remained silent. "You could have run," Felicity continued, finally meeting her eyes. "You could have saved yourself. That would have been the logical choice, the smart choice. But you didn't. You stayed. You covered her with your own body, like you were ready to die for her. I did what anyone would have done. Elise answered gently. Felicity let out a small, bitter laugh, and Elise was startled to see tears gathering in her eyes. No, Felicity said, shaking her head. That's what I told myself too. That I would have done the same. That I would have been brave and selfless. But when I heard the shots, I froze. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. I just stood there while Sterling had to drag me inside. While you were out there protecting my mother, I was hiding and shaking. Her voice broke, and a tear slid down her cheek. She did not wipe it away, as though she was too tired to keep pretending. I've been so busy hating you, she admitted, suspicious of you, waiting for you to slip up, waiting for you to reveal some hidden motive so I could say I was right about you all along. I was certain you had some selfish reason for being here, because that's all I've ever known. Everyone who comes into our lives wants something. She looked at Elise with reddened eyes. I've been angry for so long. At this life, at this family, at my brother for building walls so high no one can reach him. At everyone who walks through these doors. I thought you were just another one of them. Another person who would take what they could and leave when things became difficult. She swallowed hard. I was wrong. I'm sorry, Elise, for everything, for how I treated you, for the things I said, for making this house harder for you than it had to be. Elise studied the woman across from her, the woman she had once regarded as an enemy, and felt no triumph. Only sorrow, only the quiet recognition of someone deeply wounded. Your mother loves you, Elise said softly. That's what matters. She asks about you every single day. Even on days she forgets my name, she asks where you are. She wants to see you. Felicity began to cry then, truly cry, shoulders trembling, tears flowing without restraint. This was not the poised heiress Elise had first encountered. This was a daughter terrified of losing her mother, burdened by regret and years of distance hardened by pride. The doctors called this morning, Felicity whispered through her tears. Mom's condition is progressing faster than they expected. They said we should prepare, that we should cherish whatever time she has left. The words hung in the air like something fragile and devastating. Elise felt the ache settle deep in her chest. She had always known the disease would not end gently, but hearing that time was narrowing still struck like a blow. She reached across the space between them and took Felicity's cold hand in hers. Then let's not waste another moment fighting, Elise said, her voice steady and warm. Let's give her the best days she has left, together, as a family. Felicity looked down at their joined hands, then back up at Elise, eyes still shining with tears. She said nothing, but she nodded, and that was enough. The two women sat there in the quiet library, hands clasped, no longer adversaries. They were allies now, bound by love for the same fragile woman, and by the unspoken understanding that time was no longer a luxury they could afford to squander. The days that followed slipped through their fingers like sand through an hourglass, slow yet impossible to stop. Maggie weakened with each passing sunrise, like a candle steadily burning down to its final inch of wax. She slept more and more, sometimes waking only for a few brief hours before drifting back into exhaustion. She ate little, a few spoonfuls of porridge, a small sip of juice, then nothing. The crystal-clear days that once appeared without warning became rare, and when they came they lasted only moments. Elise, Ashton, and Felicity took turns at her bedside, 3 figures orbiting the fading center of their family, as if their presence alone could hold time and place. Ashton often came at night. He would sit in the darkness beside his mother's bed, holding her fragile hand and watching her sleep with an expression Elise had never seen before, the expression of a boy terrified of losing his mother. Felicity came during the day, reading aloud, recounting childhood memories, reminding Maggie of summers in the garden and holidays by the lake, and Elise sang. Every day she sang the songs Maggie had taught her, the melodies from the 1960s and 70s, the songs Maggie's husband once requested each night. Elise's voice became the thin thread tethering Maggie to the present, sometimes the only thing capable of pulling her through the thick fog of Alzheimer's. Then, one night, beneath a silver wash of moonlight pouring through the window, Maggie opened her eyes. They were bright, clear, luminous in a way that almost hurt to look at. This was the moment caregivers both recognized and feared, the sudden flare of brilliance before the flame went out. Call Ashton and Felicity, Maggie said, her voice steady and strong in a way it had not been for weeks. I want all three of you here. Elise moved quickly. Within minutes, Sterling had found Ashton in his office and Felicity in her room. Soon they were gathered around the bed. Ashton sat to the left, Felicity to the right, and Elise stood at the foot of the bed, feeling both like an outsider and an essential part of the moment. Maggie's gaze traveled from one face to the next, as if she were committing each of them to memory. She reached for Ashton's hand, and he enclosed it in both of his, holding it as though it were the most precious thing he possessed. My son, she said softly, my strong, broken boy. You've carried this family since you were 15. You've tried to be your father, to protect us all, but you're tired. I can see it. It's time to set the weight down. Mom, Ashton began, but his voice faltered. Maggie gave a small shake of her head. You built walls around your heart to survive. I understand. After your father died, you had to harden yourself. But walls become prisons if you stay inside too long. And you've lived in that prison for 20 years. Her eyes moved toward Elise, then back to Ashton. Let someone in. Let her in. She's good, Ashton. She's the truest thing that has walked into this house in decades. Don't lose her. Ashton did not answer. His eyes glistened. His jaw tightened as he fought for composure. His hand tightened around his mother's. Maggie turned to Felicity, who was already crying openly. My beautiful girl, Maggie whispered. My angry, wounded child. You've carried so much anger for so long. At the world, at this life, at all of us. Felicity nodded, unable to speak. Your sister is gone, Maggie said, her voice trembling at the name unspoken but understood. And you've carried that grief for 20 years. But she wouldn't want you to live in anger. She would want you to laugh, to love, to live fully. Maggie lifted a frail hand and brushed tears from Felicity's cheek. Live for both of you. That is how you honor her. I will, Felicity sobbed. I promise. Then Maggie looked at Elise, and when she smiled, it was warm and luminous. You came to us with nothing, she said gently, and you gave us everything. Tears blurred Elise's vision. You brought my son back to me. For the first time in 20 years, I've seen him truly smile. You gave me music again. You gave me good days when I thought there were none left. She beckoned Elise closer. Elise stepped to the bedside, and Maggie clasped her hand with surprising strength. Promise me, she whispered. Promise you'll take care of him. He doesn't know how to care for his own heart. He never learned. Don't let him be alone. This was never what Elise had planned. She had come for a job. For money. For survival. Not for promises that bound hearts together. But looking into Maggie's clear, trusting eyes, she could not refuse. I promise, she said, and she meant it. Maggie's smile deepened, peaceful and complete, the smile of someone who had said what needed to be said. Now sing for me, she murmured, her voice already fading. One last time. Elise drew in a trembling breath and began. You are my sunshine, my only sunshine. You make me happy when skies are gray. Her voice cracked, tears spilling freely. But she continued. Maggie closed her eyes, her smile still resting on her lips, Ashton's hand still wrapped around hers. You'll never know, dear, how much I love you. Please don't take my sunshine away. The room filled with song and sorrow and sacred stillness. And though no one spoke the words aloud, they all understood. This was the last song. This was goodbye. That morning arrived gently, as if the whole world were holding its breath in quiet anticipation. The first light of spring slipped through the curtains, scattering warm golden ribbons across the bed where Maggie lay. Outside the window, birds sang in bright, hopeful notes, and the garden she loved was coming alive with the season's earliest blooms. Ashton had sat beside his mother all through the night, his hand wrapped firmly around her fragile one. He had not slept. He simply watched her, as though committing every line of her face to memory, every strand of silver hair, every wrinkle etched by a lifetime of love. And then, in the tender hush of dawn, Maggie Kincaid slipped away. There was no struggle, no fear, no pain. She simply stopped breathing, as though drifting deeper into a peaceful sleep, as though stepping quietly into a beautiful dream she did not wish to leave. The faint smile remained upon her lips, serene and satisfied, and her hand was still clasped in her son's. Ashton wept. For the first time in 20 years, since the night his father was killed, he wept. He did not hide it. He did not swallow it down. He did not attempt to stand tall and unbreakable. He sat there holding his mother's cooling hand and cried like the 15-year-old boy who had never been allowed to grieve. Felicity rushed in when Sterling brought the news. She said nothing. She crossed the room and wrapped her arms around her brother. The two of them sat at their mother's bedside, clinging to each other, mourning together the pain they had each carried alone for far too long. Elise stood by the window, silent tears slipping down her cheeks. It felt as though a piece of her own heart had been gently torn away, leaving behind a hollow space that would never fully close. Maggie had become family to her, the mother she had never known. And now, she was gone. Elise meant to step quietly from the room, to give the Kincaids privacy in their grief, but Felicity's voice stopped her. Stay, please. She would want you here. Your family. 3 days later, the funeral was held in a small church just outside Chicago. It was private yet dignified, white flowers filling the sanctuary and candlelight flickering softly against the walls. The most powerful figures in the city attended, men whose names could shift the balance of power with a single word. Yet no one spoke of business or influence. They came to honor a woman who had been the heart of the Kincaid family, a mother, a wife, a gentle soul in a dark world. Elise was asked to sing Amazing Grace. She stood at the front of the church, looking out over the pews filled with mourners, her legs trembling beneath her. Then she saw Ashton in the front row, his gaze steady and encouraging, and she drew a deep breath. Her voice rose into the quiet sanctuary. Not flawless, not professionally trained, but sincere to its very core. She sang as though Maggie were still listening, as though somewhere beyond sight that warm smile lingered. When the final note faded, the church remained silent. Many wept, even men who had never shed tears in public before. After the service, Ashton found Elise beneath an old oak tree outside the church. She stood watching the new leaves trembling in the spring light. "What will you do now?" he asked gently. "Your contract was to care for my mother. Now that she's—" He did not finish. He did not need to. "I don't know," Elise admitted, glancing down at her hands. "I suppose I'll go back to something. Find another job. Take care of Rosie." Ashton was quiet for a moment. "Come with me," he said at last. "There's something, Felicity, and I want to show you." They drove back to the estate, and Ashton led her into a conference room she had never seen before. Felicity was already there, standing beside a long table covered in documents, architectural drawings, and a beautifully designed logo featuring a candle intertwined with musical notes. "We're creating something," Felicity said, her voice steady with resolve. "In her name, a foundation for Alzheimer's patients and their families, music therapy, emotional support, caregiver training, everything you showed us about reaching someone who's losing themselves." Ashton stepped beside his sister. "It's called Maggie's Voice, and we want you to lead it." Elise stared at them, overwhelmed. "I don't have credentials," she said softly. "I never finished school. I'm not qualified to run a foundation. You're the most qualified person I've ever known." Ashton interrupted, and there was no hesitation in his voice. "Not because of degrees, because of who you are. You taught me that not everyone has an angle. Some people simply want to help. Some people give without expecting anything in return. You have a heart money can't buy. That's the only qualification that matters." Felicity reached for Elise's hand. "Say yes, for her, for all the families who need what you gave us." Tears slipped down Elise's cheeks unchecked. She thought of Maggie's laughter, of music drifting through quiet afternoons, of a promise made beside a fading bed. "Yes," she said, her voice trembling but sure. "I'll do it." After Felicity left to begin the arrangements, Elise stepped onto the balcony overlooking the garden Maggie had loved so dearly. The roses were blooming again. White lilies lifted their heads toward the sun. The entire garden pulsed with the quiet strength of new life. Ashton joined her. He did not speak at first. He simply stood beside her, their shoulders nearly touching, listening to birdsong and the soft rustle of leaves. "Thank you," Elise said after a while. "For everything. For saving my sister. For giving me a chance. She trailed off. Ashton turned to her, and for the first time since she had met him, he smiled without restraint. It was not guarded, not distant. It was warm and real. "No," he said quietly. "Thank you, for teaching me how to feel again." They stood together looking out at the garden in bloom, at a future neither of them could fully predict. But for the first time in a very long while, they both felt something steady and bright rising in their chests. Hope. Sometimes all it takes to change a life is stepping into a snowstorm, placing your only coat over the shoulders of a stranger, and beginning to sing. This story reminds us that family is not defined by blood alone, but by the people we choose to love and protect. That the walls we build to shield ourselves can become the very prisons that confine us. And that true kindness, the kind that gives without expecting anything in return, has the power to heal wounds long thought permanent. If this story has touched your heart, please take a moment to like and share it with those you cherish. Subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the stories we share each day. We would truly love to hear what this story meant to you. Did it remind you of someone? Did it reflect something in your own life? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because every story and every feeling you bring is deeply valued. Wishing each of you good health, joy, and peace in the days ahead. Goodbye for now, and we look forward to seeing you in the next story.